So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon to you, wherever you are. Welcome to our second global conference entitled The Resurrection of Entrepreneurship, Its Role in ESG. I am Kamla Rampersad de Silva, Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. And I am very, very pleased to have had the assistance and encouragement of Professor Bob Garratt, who in discussions with me, we came up with this theme of the resurrection of entrepreneurship, its role in ESG. I know that the theme itself has excited quite a lot of persons because it suggests so much, but I want to say that in discussions with Professor Garratt, it really became clear that as we have our discussions on the evolution of governance practices, we have to also be extremely vigilant that the focus and the metrics are the things which allows us to fulfill that fundamental duty we have, which is ensuring the sustainability of our organizations. So entrepreneurship, you will hear Professor Garratt argue today, it's really the lifeblood of the organization. So we need to be creative and innovative, even as we improve our governance practices as well in areas to include the planet and people. In welcoming all of you as well, I want to share, we at CCGI welcome persons to join us in this effort. So if you are not yet a member, please make that your New Year resolution, okay? We are a nonprofit organization and it has been such an exciting journey so far. I'm really happy to share with you next year, we will be marking our 10th anniversary. That 10-year milestone, I think when we look back, we'll see has really led to a major amount of achievements. So commendations to all our past CEOs and all our past board members as well who would have contributed to it. Today has been a growing of what was put in place all those years ago as well. Today, of course, our focus is on how do we grow and understand from a number of what's happening in the world. So it's global practice that we're looking at as well. And we do have a packed agenda with a range of sessions from climate control to cybersecurity, all of it, with the focus of ESG in the background. So you can be assured that these 2 days would really stimulate a lot of thought for how we grow our governance practices in the region. So I would like to just share for everyone's reminder, or any of you who are new with us this morning, all of our sessions are recorded. These are our public events we do make available on our website after the event. Therefore, we like to ask, please, that you keep your microphones on mute during the sessions. But of course, you can keep your cameras on because it does allow us to feel a greater sense of intimacy in this Zoom room. But just to minimize any disruptive noises, do keep your microphones on mute. All of our sessions allow for a Q&A segment, which would then allow you to participate and contribute. You will need to unmute yourself, make your contribution, and then please press the mute icon again as soon as you are done. And of course, you can always ask questions or make any comments in the chat feature. Christy Johnson-Crouch, who almost all of you should know by now, Christy provides technical support for all of our Zoom sessions, and she really does an incredible job. You would all know her as providing a lot of operational support for CCGI as well. So Christy takes care of all these recordings, ensures that they are done separately each session, and she will make these links available to you after the conference as well. So if you had to miss anything, you still have an opportunity to be able to listen in. And of course, we do post a number of these videos on our YouTube channel. So we continue to have that kind of connection and growth with persons in the region. So Before I pass on to our director, Marlon Yarde, to make a few opening remarks on behalf of the board, and then to introduce our keynote speaker, I would like to share that all of you would have received the agenda in the link that was sent out by Christy this morning. And in that, you will find the detailed profiles for all of the persons who are participating today. So I have asked all of our moderators to keep the introductions brief as possible so that we focus a lot of our time on being able to engage in the conversation. So at this time, I would like to ask the Director of CCGI and the Chief Executive Officer of the Barbados Stock Exchange, Marlon Yarde, if he will bring greetings to us on behalf of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, and also to serve as moderator, introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Bob Garratt, and our two panelists as well. So I'm handing over the session to you now, Marlon.
Thank you, Kamla. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning to participate, because I think one of these things, as being a director of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, you have the opportunity to hone your skills even more and learn even more. It's the commitment of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute to create an environment where people of the Caribbean can improve and learn more about corporate governance, and particularly as it relates to new practices that are being developed around the world. I've been with the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute for a number of years. I think about 8 to 9 years I've been on the board of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. And we've done much, particularly over the last 2 to 3 years, to really create that environment of learning. The board is committed to that. We too also try very hard to make sure that we do the right things at the board level to make sure that we practice and we cultivate good, excellent corporate governance in all our dealings and all our business decisions. The Barbados Stock Exchange too is very committed to it, and that's why we've decided to be part of this this journey with the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. I would like to thank all the participants, particularly our speakers, and also to those who are listening, as being part of this session. And if you're not a member of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, I would encourage you to do so. There's lots of benefits in being a member of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. And as I said, every year I make sure our subscription, our fees are included in the budget, because I do see the value of participating in this organization. We've been very active, as Kamla has said, over the year. This has been a very busy year for us. We've tried very hard to promote best practice in corporate governance, and we've had many very interesting and varied speakers. A staple for us, though, is Professor Bob Garratt. He is a good friend of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. I remember a few years ago, he passed through our office here at the Barbados Stock Exchange, and he was very kind to gift me his two books, and I did read them. And those of you who've not read his two books, I would encourage you all to do so. One of them he's going to feature in his presentation today, The Fish Rots from the Head. And there's another book with a similar title, which covers the whole question of encouraging and helping directors, and to some extent politicians, to be better governance professionals in the areas that they're responsible for. So we want to thank Professor Garratt for his support. We want to thank him for his willingness to point us in directions sometimes that we might not have thought of, for his guidance on many issues. And we appreciate him, and we really look forward to him making his presentation today. Today, he is going to be delivering the keynote address. He is an international consultant, and as Kamla said, all the bios and information on our speakers and participants is in the agenda and briefing portion of our agenda today. Today, he's going to speak on and help us deal with the issue of the resurrection of entrepreneurship and its role in ESG. This is a topic that is very interesting and we are seeing more and more that as directors, we have to widen our scope as it relates to who the stakeholders are. In Barbados, the fiduciary responsibility of directors is primarily to the company, but in making their decisions, consideration must be given to the interests of employees and the shareholders. But we're seeing more and more with ESG that much wider group of stakeholders must be considered. The wider public at large, your business partners, your creditors, your customers, and not only from a perspective of driving more profit, which that is a byproduct of practicing good, excellent corporate governance, but it also helps create an environment in the society and in the world at large that benefits the long-term benefit of that is of benefit to everyone in the long term. So Professor Garratt is going to deliver his presentation, I think about 20 to 25 minutes. He's been allotted, that's correct, I believe, Kamla. And then we have two very erudite panelists, Safiya Noel, who is the director of Safiya Group Limited in Trinidad and Tobago, and Stephanie Neita, Corporate Secretary of the National Commercial Bank of Jamaica Limited. And I'm sure Stephanie, we might not have met directly, but you would have seen our the stock exchange and his name somewhere correspondence in your position as corporate secretary. So without any further delay, I would like to introduce Professor Bob Garratt to deliver his feature address this morning. Professor Garratt.
Thank you, Marlon. And before I say anything else, I'll say welcome to the Republic of Barbados. I trust you all celebrated last night.
Well, it was truly a momentous occasion, and we are basking in the change from being
I assume there are also some mild hangovers, but I won't go into that.
Yeah.
No, we all have work this morning, Bob.
Yeah, we all had work.
We need to take all of that in stride.
But it's great news and well received this end, certainly. Some thanks first. Thank you to the committee for inviting me to talk, but thank you also to the committee for what you've done within the last 12 months. If you think about it, this time last year, we were just experimenting with whether it was possible to have a conference which linked interested folk on the 6 continents. And not only have we done it once, and now we're in the second time, but we've done it continuously throughout the year, which is quite remarkable. So I thank you for your experimentation and in fact your entrepreneurship in that, and particularly thank Kamla. I don't know quite when she has scheduled her nervous breakdown, but it must be in the very near future, because the amount of work she's been putting in to get this stuff running is phenomenal, not just today, but over the whole year. So I've come to recognize the different tone in the telephone on Sunday night here when Kamla phones in to update me on what's going on. So all is great. And the International Learning Network, which you've set up, is beginning to motor. And I'm very interested to see whether the proposed action learning projects, which folk are now beginning to suggest, will also work over the next year. So all of that I find immensely creative and just wonderful way of tapping the energy coming out of the Caribbean at the moment, which is great news. Yes, I will speak relatively briefly for me because I want to open up to the panel, please, and then to the audience, the wider audience. When Kamla was talking about the resurrection of entrepreneurship, I was reminded of the letter I had in about May 2015, beautiful handwritten letter from Sir Adrian Cadbury just before he died. And Adrian and I corresponded in handwriting every now and again. But his last instruction to me when I was beginning to finish writing the Stop the Rot book was, please remember to go back to entrepreneurship as the start of effective corporate governance. If there isn't that energy, creativity, imagination at the start of the process, then no matter how much we work to try and contain it in various ways, we're not going to get very far. He's absolutely right. And I think the great news is that around the world now, as COVID begins to work its way through the system, we're seeing all sorts of new opportunities opening up because of the shortages and other problems that are being caused in supply chains around the world. Those notions are that, well, we're just going to have to do something a bit different and sometimes a lot different in future. And as you know me, I will always go back to the words and the meaning of words. Where does entrepreneurship come from? Well, we know that President George Bush thought the French had no word for entrepreneurship, but he was wrong there. It is a French word. And the word really in French is entreprendre, meaning to undertake, to do things. If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, then the entrepreneur is the owner of a business enterprise who, keywords, who by risk and initiative attempts to make profits. So really since about the 17th century, certainly in English, it's very much had a notion of creating a commercially viable activity. And it's the way in which we now interpret that as commercially viable is beginning to be replaced, or no, not replaced, supplemented by the notions of sustainability and community, that things begin to get interesting from our point of view as to what we are going to do in the future. But I've always seen the board's role in this as being, going back to the original French, and really being the stager of dramas, i.e. the producer of dramas. It's up to the board to actually say, on the big stage, on the big scene, what drama are we going to produce, which in the end will give us the various types of wealth or various types of capital we want out of the other end of the process. And to be a producer, you've got to have a lot of guts, but you've got to have vision, impact, and the ability to deliver. One of the pieces of work I've been doing over many years now is to look at the psychological profiles, particularly of the preferences of boards of directors. Now, my work is mainly on the UK and some English-speaking Commonwealth countries, but we've tried it out in other countries as well. One of the shocking things for me is that most people who go onto boards are not terribly interested in the future. And that 10 years ago when I started doing this was a huge shock to me. I realized then when I started looking into this that one of the reasons is because A, they tend not to have a lot of time to attend board meetings, and they assume that most board work is only done at board meetings. And B, they are much more interested in the micro-politics of the board than in the future of the company. So, all right, sorry, Christy, you're coming through with the, yeah, okay, with the slides. I was plowing on regardless until they caught up. Fine, thanks. What I'm saying now isn't on slides, it's just an aside. I got very interested in the fact that the energy around the boardroom table is often spent in dealing with the immediate rather than the future, and the immediate in two ways. And they're both about power, really. One is what is the power of the ideas we're working with, so ideas power, and the other is the power of direction, of where we are actually going. And to my surprise, again, perhaps I was being extremely naive, most of the energy that was looking at the present was about ideas power and not really thinking, again, about what direction are we going to take. And the notion of going into the future, both with imagination on the one hand and vision on the other, is played down. So I'm still working on those figures, still looking at it, but I find it a very consistent pattern that I won't go into the details of the rest of the research, but this notion that if we're a stage of dramas, we're trying to move it, create our new future, that is really quite a task for many people who, for the best of purposes, are happy to join a board and happy to work with it, but tend to get sucked almost immediately into the micro-politics of the board and not really spending a lot of time, 24/7, in fact, time, thinking about what is the future, what's happening out there, and how do we bring that in to stage our dramas. May I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So we've talked a lot about ESG over the past year, and Kamla's mentioned as well. So how best do we frame our enterprise in terms of our impacts on not just finance, but on the physical environment, the social environment, and the governance? But particularly, I'm saying here, not the governance environment, governance competence, which we have very few ways of measuring at the moment. What is interesting, certainly looking at the work in the City of London and increasingly coming out of the States at the moment, but we begin to see it also coming out of the Gulf, the Jane Vowles and her people, is that we're beginning to get some measures on our impact on the physical environment through sustainability measures, resource usage measures, etc. We're beginning to have some notions of exactly how community or social environments are impacted. And those measures are beginning to allow a different approach to financing. So it's not just about shares, etc., but we're beginning to see the very early stages of bonds, but not just bonds, performance-based bonds coming out of an investor's wish to back projects which will have physical, social, and financial impacts. And then almost separately, are those performance-based activities and measures, which I stress are still in the very early stages, do we have any ways in which we could begin to think about governance bonds, ways in which not medium to long-term finance rather than short-term finance can be built around the development of the growing competencies of boards in relation, particularly, I would argue, to entrepreneurship, and then the consequent impact in physical and social terms of that, of their enterprises on those environments. And you're beginning to see some national governments, but a lot of pressure groups now, beginning to exert more pressures on developing this. So in a sense, I think the zeitgeist, the general feeling, the emotional temperature of what's happening around corporate governance at the moment is beginning to focus much more back on the purpose of the activity. So again, entrepreneurship. Yesterday, I was having a discussion with a very senior director of a global company. And I was talking to him about this, and he suddenly had a blinding flash of the obvious and said, do you know what we ought to do nowadays? We ought to actually resurrect the memorandum and articles of association. And I said, well, we've got the articles. And he said, yeah, but we took a decision 10 years ago as a board to drop the memorandum. And what you've just been saying means that I think we should actually, as a board, go back and reinstate the memorandum with a much clearer purpose. because the original memorandum allowed us to do just about anything, and then it had catch-up clauses at the end to ensure that we could do anything. But I think nowadays, with the pressures coming on about ESG, we really need to be quite clear as to why we are in business, what areas we want to operate in, clarify the whole thing, condense it, cut it right down. So we're not a general purpose vehicle, but we're a particular purpose vehicle. And then I added, and to do that, we need a conscience of the board, and I'll come back to that. May I have the next slide, please, Jessie? So, as I said, we're looking for new metrics in the area. I am insisting really that it's not just environment and social impacts and government competence, but we've got to face up to some rather tricky facts, which I mentioned earlier in this year, but I'll come back to them again. Right the way back to Adam Smith, remembering that Adam Smith, half of his work and all his early work, and then half of the famous the book on the creation of wealth, half of that book is on moral sentiment. And his original book was on moral sentiment. And what he was arguing in The Wealth of Nations was this whole issue that, yes, we need to ensure that we create surplus profit. It doesn't need to be excessive. And we must always have in mind how the distribution of that profit is going to affect the rest of our communities. Most people don't know that. They think the whole Wealth of Nations argument is all about rampant capitalism. And it isn't. It's not that at all. But it's become branded as such. So what he was saying is there seemed to be the formation of the very concept of companies in their present form, the notion that we should have unlimited size, we can grow in any way we want, we should have unlimited life, we are immortal, effectively, that we should have unlimited license, we can do what we want, what we feel like at the time, and consequently, we will have unlimited power. Now, all of those are now coming under great pressure, not just from pressure groups and the general public, but in legislation in various countries. So the notion of what size should a company be is seen only too clearly with the fun and games that's going on, particularly in Silicon Valley. And Mark Zuckerberg and all the rest are under considerable pressure on size and license. They aren't very long-lived at the moment, so there's a big issue there, but some companies seem to go on forever without any particular checks on them, and they exercise all sorts of forms of power. I'm not just attacking the Silicon Valley folk, but I'm saying that this is true in many countries I've seen, where companies simply plow on the assumption they will be there forever. But we are reopening this notion now of human duties. So not just the rights to continue forever, but what are the consequent duties we've got to deliver in our societies through the conscience of the board to ensure their future purpose, the strategic deployment of the assets of their enterprise, which is rarely taken into great consideration by boards, but all of this now under a growing public gaze, and with the social media asking more and more questions, some of them very difficult to answer indeed, about why this company is doing what it's doing and why it should exist at all. So the impersonal status of the company, I argue, is beginning to be rebalanced by the personality of the board, not the company, but of the board, beginning to show it has a human conscience, and it is increasingly going to be a very effective part of the society in which it is allowed to exist legally. May I have the next slide, please? So one of the things you could argue is we're beginning to see the gentle, at the moment, degrading of some of the notions that have been around for so long in corporate governance. Now, we've talked before about shareholder supremacy, and we've had various talks about that during the year. But we now are pretty sure that certainly in the common law-based countries, but it's true of some other countries as well, that we are now very clear that the shareholder does not own the company. The law has always been clear on that since the turn of the 19th century, but the people have behaved, particularly out of the States from the 1950s, as though that was not true. It is now absolutely true. And we're beginning to see that shareholders own a share of a business, but they do not own the business. Alongside that notion of shareholder supremacy, we've seen the notion of financial supremacy, that everything in the end is reduced to financial numbers and financial reporting. That is really now being disputed as ESG develops, and you will know from things I've said this year that I think it's EESG. So the E is the enterprise part, so today's talk, linking to how we deliver our dramas in the environment and in the social context, and then how we add to that effective corporate governance. The listed company focus, which here I'm talking about the development of the codes particularly, rather than the law. The listed company development focus was very, very clear. And in fact, when Adrian Cadbury published his the 1992 report, was on the financial aspects, note that, the financial aspects of corporate governance, and it was funded by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales and the London Stock Exchange. No harm in that because it was looking at the financial aspects, but it sort of got stuck in the world's mind that it was always about or generated from the needs of listed companies. And most of the codes that have been developed, of which there are at least 500 now around the world, have tended to have a fairly strong listed company focus. But we all know, in many senses, that's nonsense, because at least 95% of the companies around the world are not listed and never will be. And so this whole notion that we should be led by a listed company in terms of the code is increasingly challenged. And it's being challenged because of family businesses, of small businesses, of state-owned enterprises, of not-for-profits, et cetera, saying that we can't easily fit ourselves into the codes that were developed for listed companies. This is not to knock listed companies, it's just to say that the focus of our legislators and our regulators is now being challenged more and more to say, let us widen it and let us take our stage dramas into a much, much wider field effectively. Current accounting and audit practice, we've had a lot on that during this year, and the work that Professor Mervyn King talked about, I think that if you haven't seen his webcast, then I strongly recommend you look at it, because I think it's the future of global reporting as a fairly standardized form of reporting and of audit. I think that is so important to understand that we are beginning to see the breakup of the old accounting and audit practices, which are under so much criticism in so many countries at the moment, that something has to give. And the work he's been doing with the United Nations on his globally accepted reporting practices, I think is absolutely crucial to understand. And you'll be able to pick some of that up tomorrow in this conference when Caroline Chalmers talks about ISO 37000 and the work that's running in parallel there. Really very exciting. Fund management, I think, as we've known it, there are some very successful fund managers, but frankly, the argument is very few. The wonderful Merrin Somerset Webb of the Financial Times back in the, I think it's 2015, wrote a very good, a very long article called Our Investment Managers, sorry, let me try again. It was called If Investing is a Game of Poker, Our Investment Managers Are Busted Flush. And then she came out with very, very strong arguments saying yes. And she was very puzzled, as I am still, as to why people pay management fees, particularly in funds that, for example, are simply tracker funds, etc., etc. The whole of that notion is up for grabs at the moment. So those elements are just some of the things that I think are of descending importance, and they are beginning to be taken over by a whole new wave coming through. So if you like, you can see that top, I haven't put this on the slide, but you can see that top group as the purgatory we're now in. So good souls have to go into a period of purgatory and expiate their sins before they can come out into more liberated fields. And I think one of the things we're watching is a form of purgatory at the moment for much of the existing world of corporate governance. The liberated world comes from what is listed in the second bullet point there, which is the vast growth of the notion of stakeholder supremacy. So not just shareholder power, but the other powers that come out of the development in the staff of intellectual property, of sheer hard work, etc., on the one hand, but on the other hand, the powers to oversee from society this notion of the license to operate for any future company. So how would a future company begin to very closely look at what it gives back? And this notion of giving back, I think, becomes very important at this stage. What it gives back in environmental terms, sustainability terms, what it gives back to the community in other terms, in terms of employment, obviously, but in many other ways as well. And how that begins to put new cement in our institutions. I mentioned in one of my previous talks that E.O. Wilson, the social environmentalist, gave a lovely quote, which I still have firmly in my mind, which is that we enter the 21st century with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, and we are a danger to ourselves. And I'm very interested, particularly in that medieval institutions part of what the pressure, particularly from ESG and the new entrepreneurial opportunities of ESG are going to put on our boards, and the way that's going to force our imaginations to look at new types of business and new ways of doing business. And Peter Aylwin is going to talk after me, so I won't steal his thunder, but you know, his work that's very exciting at the moment on the next generation have different values. And whether we like it or not, the values of people like me are under great pressure in terms of the way we take our boards forwards, we generate our enterprises. And their values will be seen more and more because they will be the ones that are making the investments. And Peter's figures, particularly but not exclusively, on the family offices and their values about the importance of long-term profitability rather than short-term investment. Those people are beginning to come to power in offices in ways that were not fully understood. But the amounts of money that he is talking about, even amongst the family offices, and in terms of investment over the next 10 years, could easily be as high as $10 trillion. But if you then add back the other investments that are going on anyway, we're most probably talking of a $60 to $70 trillion investment opportunity change, which the values of the younger generation are likely to push. So this great wealth transfer that he's talking about is a terrific challenge to us all, but also a terrific opportunity if people are really going to be entrepreneurs and drive forward into the post-COVID world. May I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so there's the quote I've just given. So we won't go to that. May I have the next slide, please? But this sort of thing, I think, needs then a lot of backing, accepting that directing is a proper job and takes 24/7 commitment, the full funding and development of the selection, induction, personal development, competence assessment, and deselection of the board is properly budgeted in time and money terms in a board, in a company's budget, so that we can really begin to spend the necessary time and develop the necessary imagination and implementation competencies. That's still not done very often at all. I'm very keen on my own boards to ensure that there is a personal commitment by each director to the legal purpose of the board and to the 7 duties of a director. So section 172, section 171 of the UK's Company Act. And that has a very interesting effect, behavioral effect and attitudinal effect on the directors, who actually make a solemn commitment to each other around the boardroom table that is what they're there to do. And as soon as they've done that, then that actually is quite freeing, because it allows them to say, I don't know about a lot of things. And I've talked before about the use of intelligent naivety, but they can say, I'm intelligently naive about this particular issue we're looking at. Can others help me? And if no one can help me, then we have a legal obligation to go outside the board to get the necessary information we need to be able to carry out our due diligence. So that, I think, is all part of the opportunity coming up for the future, one to which we must personally commit. And then I've whittled on before, so I won't say much about it at the moment, but I think above all of this, we need some sort of notion of an integrated governance system at national level, where we have regular dialogue between directors, stakeholders, politicians, and regulations, but under public oversight, which may be through a royal commission or a national commission or a permanent standing commission to have a look at that. May I have the next slide, please? Well, those are just a reminder that what I'm talking about. So I won't go into the details of the 7 duties, but there they are. May I have the next slide, please? And the work I'm working on at the moment is the levels of board maturity, is just beginning to actually find some metrics and some measures by which we can see how mature is this board, or how mature are certain members of the board, particularly if we're inducting new people onto the board. Where are they? Are they accidentally there? They don't even realize they're directors, they haven't been properly informed, they certainly haven't been trained. Or are they grudgingly compliant? They're grumpy around the boardroom table because they're forced to do these board meetings, but nobody really understands what they're for, and they can't see any particular output that's necessary. Or have they crossed the line and said, actually, it is a proper job. We do need to train ourselves. We do need budgets for that. And we become a learning board. And then from that, can we move forward in the end to become a professional board where we actually fulfill sections 171 and 172 of the Companies Act in our normal work? It's just a normal job of being a director. That's from my new book, Shining a Light in a Naughty World, that looks at these levels of maturity. Right, can I have I think it's the last slide, please? Yeah, so, well, you know the pictures. So we've done this before, but so the work is moving around the cycle from policy formulation, external view, how do we spend much more time scanning the external environment, long term, then taking our scarce strategic resources and turning them into the enterprise that we want to, and then moving across to short-term internal, making sure our management pick it up and run with it with the best internal systems possible, and then driving that up to the top left-hand corner, short-term and external, making sure we are properly accountable. So the balance moving from current board conformance on the left to future board performance on the right. The next slide you will know is the full learning board slide. But the one thing we've been talking about throughout this year, particularly with the Caribbean folk and the folk in the Gulf, is the adding of just those two words at the very center. The board is the business brain, but now and conscience. And that's where I support totally the work that Mervyn King is doing in that area, to say that we have a duty, you can call it a moral duty, call it an ethical duty, whatever, but we have a duty as directors to make sure that we are the conscience of the firm. And as a little aside and a plug for Friday, I argue very strongly that the company secretary has a role in trying to make sure we develop our conscience heads. May I have the next slide, please? So watch out for movements that are going on. The public encouragement of the public are in many, many countries now increasingly critical of current directors and current financial activities. So the notion of the board conscience developing through EES plus G is just about beginning to seep into their consciousness. But the international demand for accreditation of registered directors is definitely growing. And we see it a lot at the moment. We're particularly seeing it in the Gulf with the 6 nations of the Gulf Cooperation Council, really going surprisingly strongly in terms of ensuring that people becoming directors, not just of listed companies, but in state-owned enterprises and in the not-for-profit world, actually beginning to have to register as a director and then train, basic training as a director. The generational shift I've already mentioned, but Peter will be talking about that, so I won't go into that in great detail. Caroline Chalmers' session tomorrow morning, ISO 37000, is, I think, well worth listening to, and that links to the Mervyn King work on the globally accepted comprehensive reporting system. May I have the last slide, I think? Please. Yeah, thanks for listening. So no codes, you'll notice, or regulations were used or referred to during the making of this presentation. And I'm saying that's the company secretary's role, so tune in on Friday for that. But the important thing there is that in terms of enterprise, of entrepreneurship, we have the most amazing opportunities opening up right across the world. Most of us are in trouble in various ways, economically and socially. And I think the development of effective corporate governance is going to be one of the binding elements for our future society. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Professor Garratt. We really appreciate your comments and your thoughts. I would let our 2 panelists speak first, but there are some questions I have to ask you on the topic. Strange enough, I noted that both our panelists, Safiya Noel and Stephanie Neita, both have the same initials for their names. And I was going to go by alphabetical order, but then that didn't work. So I see Safiya, the second letter of her name is A, so, and she's the second person, she's the first person to listed as the panelist to speak. So let us hear from Safiya Noel, Managing Director of Safiya Group Limited of Trinidad and Tobago, on her thoughts on the presentation made by you, Dr. Garratt. Safiya? Oh, it's Johnson, not Noel.
Yeah, well, it's Johnson Noel, so that's fine. So thank you so much, Marlon, and hello, everyone. I know it's morning in some parts and then afternoon in others, but it's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. And thank you, Professor Garratt, for that instructive presentation. You know, at the heart of it, and I want to piggyback, and perhaps from my perspective, because I'm a leadership strategist, just pulling together what I hear coming out from Professor Garratt, and certainly even Mervyn King, from his perspective, you know, the heart of corporate governance is about leadership. And for me, that's how I see it. At the heart of it, corporate governance, and certainly all the other elements of the ESG framework, as well as entrepreneurship itself, is about leadership. And leadership, I often say, is the single most influential factor in any environment, hands down. And it can get somewhat uncomfortable for some, but this discussion is something that we must have if we are to truly move from just dialogue to implementation. And I want to share with you very quickly some instructive information coming out of some research done by Harvard Business School. It surrounds the trickle-down effect of leadership with reference to contagious behaviors. All right, they studied 51 behaviors, all with some level of contagion. However, there were 30 behaviors that were highly contagious, much like COVID-19. You know, and from my years of experience, I imagine there are also many variants and mutations of how these behaviors present lower down the hierarchy. But these 30 contagious behaviors were grouped into 8 clusters, from most contagious to the least contagious. And I could ask Christy just to share this one slide so you can see it visually, the 8 most contagious behaviors. All right, and these behaviors are those that are exhibited by the highest rank of the organization. And it shows itself, it populates itself all through the organization. The most contagious develop in self and others. Then you have technical skills, you have strategy skills, consideration and cooperation, integrity and honesty, global perspective, decisiveness, and results focus. So this information is to provide further evidence that in order to see and experience the change and benefits of corporate governance, as well as careful management of the environmental and social impacts of our organizations, it must start with those who hold the highest level of influence. That is the board, and I would dare say the executives, all right? If it's not espoused at that level, it just will not happen. You cannot hire out the ownership of that change. You cannot hire out the mindset that must accompany the change. You as leaders, we as leaders, we have to commit to understanding what is necessary and then take the action, even if it's baby steps, even if it's baby steps. It will send a clear and positive signal to your stakeholders, especially your team, that ESG is important to your organization. Now, this in turn will attract a number of benefits, including the attractiveness to investors and even a lower cost of capital. And this next generation investors, this great wealth transfer is a very, very interesting thing. And you're going to see that they look for organizations that take into clear consideration environmental and social impacts. That is where they're going to put their money. So if it is your mind is even all trained on just financial return, there is still a huge argument to espouse strong corporate governance if it is you are to see those financial returns. I will stop there for now. So thank you so much. Thank you, Christy, for sharing this slide.
Thank you, Safiya. I really appreciate your contribution. And let's not keep Stephanie waiting too long. Stephanie is the Corporate Secretary at National Commercial Bank Limited, National Commercial Bank Jamaica Limited in Jamaica. So over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Marlon. I'd just like to make one minor correction. I'm actually the Assistant Corporate Secretary at NCB. And
so you do the heavy lifting?
I support it, yes. So, you know, I found Professor Garratt's presentation very interesting. and also the comments followed by Safiya about the heart of governance being leadership. When I reflect on Professor Garratt's point about entrepreneurship, we tend to think about, you know, small and medium enterprises and what those entrepreneurs bring to the table, which is usually, you know, the talent, the creativity, the imagination. And as we know, for any successful organization, we need a pool of resources, and usually where that creativity and imagination and so on lies, the other aspects are not necessarily there. And this is why there is the need for a board. And interestingly, the profiles that Professor Garratt referred to, where the focus has been not necessarily so much on long term. And this is exactly why when we are looking at how we want to lead the organization, we need to look for a variety of talents, and, you know, not necessarily so much sometimes from the family-owned perspective. The focus is really just to support that person who has that entrepreneurial drive. And so they're not able to look at what's in it for the long term. And as I say, just focusing on what happens at a board meeting, and not necessarily thinking growth, sustainability, and that sort of thing. And this is why we have the need for governance tools, and there are various codes available now. And perhaps through COVID, I think the virtual world has opened us up to a lot more access to resources and training. And when we look at the governance tools, I don't want to go too much into it because perhaps this is something that might be discussed during the conference. But certainly when we're looking at the governance tools, we need to look at our board composition, what those persons can bring to the table. We need to look at talent management, not only from the perspective of the board, but certainly from the organization, so that there's always fresh thinking. There are different perspectives, different experiences, different ages of persons contributing to the organization. And then we need to look at what type of policies do we want to have in place, because when there are small and medium enterprises, there's a need for access to funding, access to grants, whatever it is that may be. But and all those persons are looking on as to how the organization is structured. Purpose, as Professor Garratt mentioned, is very important. He made reference to a suggestion for resurrecting the memorandum of association, but making it clearer. And I thought about my own organization, where within the last year or so, we looked back at what our purpose is. And we came up with 3 short statements: empowering people, unlocking dreams, and building communities. And I think that's really very powerful, and sets it out clearly that we don't need to read a long document as to what our purpose is. And it's important to be continuously revisiting where we are in terms of what we have established as our purpose, where we are in terms of the whatever metrics that we have set for ourselves, and constantly refreshing. So the other thing I'd like to just mention too is that currently there are no programs available where those who may be short on funding, they can still access resources on not only to start up your organization, but how to sustain it, because I think it is recognized that that is an issue, sustaining our organizations. I think that's where I'll leave it for now, and then we can continue.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, we've heard from our featured speaker, and we've heard from our two panelists. There are one or two questions I know each of us have, and I want to give persons the opportunity to ask those questions. I'll probably start the ball rolling with you, Professor Garratt, by asking you the question of your slide that had specifically ESG, environmental, social, and governance too. You stated in the first bullet point, these pressures will involve new metrics for measuring E+S impacts and governance competence. These are hardly developed. Could you give us an idea from your global perspective, where are we, governance professionals as a whole, where are we in developing these metrics for measuring environmental, social, and governance?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that we do it because it's still such a messy field. But if the various centers now around the world are coming out with sustainability measures, and I think we'll have some talk on that later today and during tomorrow. But let me just quickly note here. We had, there's a climate measure, 100, which is going around. But there are a lot. If you just look up, for example, sustainability metrics now on the website, it's astonishing what's there. There are fewer at the moment on the social, the community one, but the impact of the ways in which measures on future employment and employability, future education, future things like the anti-slavery laws and the anti-money laundering laws are beginning to affect societies. Those things are fairly easily available, but at the moment in a very loose form. And I can't say, look, if you follow the following, then that's it. You're okay. You're compliant. It's not like that at the moment. But my argument is, if you like, the zeitgeist, the emotional temperature internationally as such, to say we've now got to get these sorted. The governance ones in some ways are easier. I think if we go back to the stuff that I was talking about, it's relatively easy for a board to actually work out how it's delivering on those 7 duties of a director. It's not terribly difficult to see whether people, for example, just take one of them, the duty of being careful and skillful and diligent in the way in which they take their decisions for their future strategy. Those are not terribly difficult to tease out. What does that mean? Are we careful? Particularly, are we diligent in the way we actually seek information? And that some very simple things can be done. I mean, I've done it on some boards whereby we were able to have a quick look at the quality of the information that was put before the board prior to a decision being taken. And you can quickly look at the size and depth of the information that was provided. And sometimes it was very, very good indeed. And if we were very lucky, then you could get a very concise argument, a very clearly argued argument with metrics into 4 A4 pages. But on other boards we had a look at, frankly, there was virtually no information provided. There was data provided, but much of that data came from the individual directors' opinions around the boardroom table rather than hard data. So it wasn't carefully checked out facts, and it wasn't skillfully developed. So it wasn't particularly diligent in the way in which the decision was taken. And sometimes, one powerful individual, either the chief executive or the chairman, would simply dump something on the table and say, sign here, please. And that is not an unknown phenomenon. And Marlon, you're laughing, but it's, as a board, you can begin to sort out what is it that we're actually going to measure. Can we simple things are measured, and you're seeing this beginning to appear in some of the regulatory, the levels of independent thought on a board. At the moment, it's still fairly crude, but you can see whether a person is so cross-connected that they haven't a hope in hell of actually being able to take an independent. And I'm having this particular problem right now in a number of companies, particularly in the Gulf, where the family members are so interconnected that the notion of independence of thought is not possible, really. And yet these companies are currently going for major international IPOs. And the people doing due diligence on them are saying, well, how on earth are decisions taken around this table? Because independence doesn't seem to be a possibility. I don't have an easy answer to that at the moment, but it's a big issue. And in some cases, they're beginning to say, until we sort out the next generation issue again, not about funding, but the next generation issue in terms of the quality and development of those people from both within and without the family, we're not going to be able to answer that question. In one case I can think of immediately, they're actually withdrawing their IPO because they're so horrified by what the IPO would actually show to the rest of the world about the bad quality of what is going on around a number of their boardroom tables, that they now would be humiliated by making that public. So there are some measures around. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Garratt. We have our close-off time for this session is 12 o'clock Barbados time.
Yeah.
So I will give the, and so we have another 5 minutes. So I'll give the audience an opportunity, participants an opportunity to ask any questions they may have. Please don't embarrass me. Ask your questions.
Is Kamla there? She has asked questions on all of my stuff.
Yes, I am, but we do in fact have a question. It's from Donna. Let me just see it. I'll read it out for you very quickly, Marlon. It's from Donna Avery. She says, when you say the resurrection of entrepreneurship, are you referring primarily to intrapreneurship, that is, established companies acting entrepreneurially? And if so, are you saying that this will be required for companies to embrace ESG successfully? I think that's a brilliant question, Professor Garratt.
Well, I was mainly referring to externally orientated entrepreneurship, but I completely take a point on entrepreneurship as well, because it's the development, particularly of the ideas from within the company and the intellectual property that is developed during that time, which can be so valuable. The ways in which ideas are stopped within companies is always fascinating. And there's a mixture of humility that maybe my idea isn't good enough to actually raise, but also, we've either done that before, a typical response that stops a lot of entrepreneurship. And we tried that. Now is not the time. Well, in theory, it's never the time. It's just a case of getting on and trying it. So for example, with the entrepreneurship issue, is it feasible? And I've done this a number of times, long before I got mayor board, to say to a senior person, give me cover for anything from a few weeks to a few months to let me develop this idea and try it out in very small pilot studies to come back to you to say, look, this I think will work. Are you willing to take the risk to take this forward? And I have to say personally, every time I've done that, we've actually gone forward and developed something, not necessarily exactly what I was talking about, but something that worked and was beneficial to the company. So I'm not sure that answers the question in full, but I'm also aware the time is ticking away. So
that's quite okay, actually. I'm sure persons will not mind if we go in a few minutes, because it's meant to be a short break afterwards. But just to alert persons, you all really want to be present for the next session, because as Professor Garratt mentioned, the idea of having metrics which is able to capture these issues of ESG and sustainability. We have a really brilliant presentation from Dr. Charles Ehart, who would be sharing some of those metrics from KPMG in New Zealand for our next session. But Professor Garratt, I would like to ask you, because we do have this issue of boards confronted with fundamental change as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic, are you finding in your experience that they are open enough to the ideas of creativity and innovation to be able to develop the performance of the organization? Or are you seeing a resistance on the part of the board to wanting to direct the company that way and still dependent on management to come up with those ideas, and the board only looking at financial metrics? Are you seeing that movement away from that behavior?
I'm seeing very little resistance at the moment, really dug in deep resistance to the fact that we're going to have to change in significant ways now in all our organizations, including not-for-profits, including state-run enterprises, as well as the businesses, whether private or publicly listed businesses. The ways in which those ideas are then taken forward are frankly very messy still. And I'm delighted we have our next speaker on sustainability, because that I think is an area where it will help boards enormously when they begin to focus on the fact that they are not autonomous enterprises, but exist within societies. They, in fact, exist within ecosystems in their society, and that what COVID has shown us is that we are actually quite fragile, even in large organizations within those ecosystems. Without breaking any confidence, it was only yesterday I was talking to a director of one of the oil majors, and he was saying, had you told me even 4 years ago that we would be having discussions around our boardroom table as to about how long we might continue as an oil and gas major, I just wouldn't have paid any attention to you whatsoever. Now we are having to really think very, very seriously about our future. And we are determined that we will have a future, but it will be very different from what it's been before. And the things you've talked about to me yesterday about the 4 unlimiteds are all very much part of our thinking. That we know that we're almost certainly going to have to fragment, to change, to not bully people around the world. But we also know that we will continue because we have terrific resources. We just need to deploy them differently to achieve surplus, not necessarily massive profit, but surplus. Yeah.
And as a follow-up, I wanted to ask you, during our discussion, you mentioned some concerns about this whole notion of greenwashing. Would you like to share with us?
No, I didn't mention greenwashing. Yeah. No, I would leave it to our next distinguished speaker to talk a bit about greenwashing. But I mean, there is. I didn't mention it deliberately at all. What I did say was I had a real nudge at the fund managers who were just using tracker funds. There is, in fact, actually, I have it on the desk in front of me. This is, I doubt if you can see it properly, but this is, would you believe, a paid-for advert from The Economist magazine, a very relatively conservative magazine, The Economist, last week. And it begins by saying ESG is BS. And then goes into the details of that as to why so many people are greenwashing and generally adding false labels to very debatable investment opportunities. But really ESG, I think, is generated not out of fund managers, but out of boardrooms, because they are the ones who in the end have the legal liability for it. Most fund managers might be had up for false pretenses or presenting something that is not fully or totally true. But I would argue that many people in the world, even if they're not totally articulate about it, many members of the public know that somehow we have to link financial capital with environmental capital, with social capital in a new way. And then we have to govern that.
And for our participants, you know, I just want to share this whole notion of greenwashing is something that isn't new. It didn't come about with the discussion when the term ESG was formulated. It's really been with us for quite a number of years since, in fact, we've been discussing sustainability. Professor Mervyn King introduced that notion more than a decade ago with the King reports. And since then, we are grappling with organizations that are engaging in greenwashing. And greenwashing essentially is where there is really more, and these are my own words, you know, more of a pretense of being more environmentally conscious than you actually are. And sometimes it's very deliberate in terms of mislabeling products and so, you know, to fool customers. But as we have these discussions now, it's so important that board members be aware of the practice. And in fact, you know, as we always mention in these events, the tone at the top, you know, which essentially is what Professor Garratt spoke about when he wrote that amazing bestseller, The Fish Rods from the Head. It's so dependent on all of us in the boardrooms to be aware and vigilant and ensure that we are not only engaged in greenwashing, but we truly understand the ESG metrics and are taking these into consideration.
Yeah. Okay.
Do we still have more time, Kamla, or do we need to close now and let people go on their break?
Yes, we can close. Yeah, so you can invite each of our panelists, Marlon, to share their closing thoughts, and Professor Garratt, and then we can take what would most likely be about a 15-minute break then before we move into the next session.
Stephanie, I'll start with you to give your closing remarks.
Thank you. So I think it's an exciting time for governance now. There is a lot to learn and for persons to adopt, and the information and the resources are out there. And so I encourage entrepreneurs to, you know, be open and seek to widen their horizons, not only from what they know, but to pull on resources that are available. And that's, you know, both physical resources and that sort of thing, and and focusing on ESG and having those metrics available, utilized in the way they operate.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Safiya?
Sure. Thank you, Marlon. I would just end off by saying, you know, any meaningful impact in our organizations will remain the responsibility of the leaders, those who hold the influence. And I continue to say that. And, you know, it even forces us as leaders to sometimes unlearn some things, you know, because the environment within which we have been bred in entrepreneurship may not espouse some of these new things that we want to introduce. And so there may be some unlearning and relearning that has to take place, and it must start with the influence holders. It must start at the board levels. It must start at that very high executive level for us to see any meaningful change. So I'd want to encourage us to do exactly that. Thank you.
And Professor Garratt, you have the final word, sir.
Okay, very few. Well, what I'm going to do after Christmas, I'm joining up with 2 colleagues, and in most countries, the law of conspiracy begins with just 3 people. And so I'm going to continue what I started, but it was stopped dead at the first COVID lockdown. I'm going to continue the pressure I'm putting on a parliamentary group at Westminster in London, who are quite keen to talk through the way in which governance can be developed, a mixture of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Interested parties, it's not a formal committee. But what shocked me when I was talking with them is I asked them, can any of you in this room just give me 3 of the 7 duties of the director? Because you're the people who pass the legislation. Nobody could. And so I'm going to put my energy into trying to not just create the general public debate, but that's important. But I also want to go to the legislators to get them to see if they can understand how they can actually implement the existing legislation. Because I think if we can do that, and as I said at the very beginning, with the 54 Commonwealth countries using the same basic law, if we can all begin to talk a bit more to our legislators about that, we will develop better boardroom practice, and I would argue much better regulation. So that's where I'm going.
Thank you, Professor Garratt. And as encouraged by all our speakers, let us try and learn as much as we can about the topic. Of late, I'm taking I won't say the lazy way, but on Sundays, after going to church virtually, I spend most of the day just going through webinars on YouTube on topics that I'm interested in relation to work. So I say I'm not working, but I find it that way you learn so much by just going online, putting in a topic as it relates. I remember a few weeks ago I had to do a presentation on ESG, put in the topic, and tons of webinars come up, and you just sit down and you listen. Sometimes you take notes. I have my laptop in front of me and I type up a few notes, and you learn so much. It's an easy way to pull the information. And thank you. What time is our next session, Kamla?
So it starts in 20 minutes from now. So that would be 12:30 our time here in the Caribbean. I want to share though that for our speaker, it will be 5:30 a.m. for him in New Zealand. So I really am so appreciative of our speakers around the world who are making this effort, to do this. I want to tell you, Dr. Charles Earhart will be joined by 2 panelists as well. They are Antonio Ferrier, who is from Trinidad and Tobago, and Peter J.R. Olwyn, who is no stranger to us here at CCGI. And I know that's going to be an extremely interesting session. Our moderator will be Camille Hayes, who is the Executive Director at the Barbados International Business Association. I'm hearing this loudspeaker in the background by me. So before you guys hear about fish on sale here in Trinidad and Tobago, let's bring this session to a close. Professor Garratt, thank you so very much, as usual. I know that over the next 3 days, we will continue to have you engaged with us, and we would be able to also get so much more of your wisdom as well. So Safiya, I appreciate you being, joining us for this session, and Stephanie especially. I know it was a very last minute ask on our part, but it was very gracious of you to agree and come on, and I thank you all very much. Thank you, Marlon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. So just to let you know, the room remains open, so you can remain connected, but we will have a short break now. Essentially 15 minutes by my clock, and then we return at 12:30 our time here to start session 2 of our two-day conference on corporate governance, the resurrection of entrepreneurship, its role in ESG. So see you guys in a bit.